Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us for EMCA's Revolution of 1821, Hellenic Cotton Triangle Merchants, and the American Civil War panel discussion, which is in association with the HEPA's Hellenic Cultural Commission. My name is Lou Katzos. I'm EMCA's president and the HEPA's National Hellenic Cultural Commission chairman. I will introduce and moderate today's panel. Our distinguished panel includes Clemson University professor Orville Vernon Burton, the Judge Matthew T. Perry Distinguished Chair of History and the director of the Clemson Cyber Institute, author, writer, lecturer, and EMCA director Alexander Bolinas, and lawyer, adjunct instructor, and graduate candidate in history at Clemson University, Megan Gaston. A little background for the audience relating to the Hellenic merchants a little before this period and during the Ottoman period. Probably the single most important development in the Hellenic world during the 18th century and beyond was the emergence of an entrepreneurial, prosperous, and far-flung mercantile class, which played a major role in the economic life not only of the Ottoman Empire, but elsewhere, and also throughout Europe. Hellenic merchants, discouraged from investing their capital within the Ottoman Empire by the arbitrariness and rapacity of the Ottoman state, played an active role in developing commerce in Hungary and Transylvania, in southern Russia, where Empress Catherine II, or the Great, encouraged them to settle after Russia's borders had extended to the Black Sea and beyond. The Hellenic language, as a result, became the common language of Balkan communities and commerce as these merchants challenged the existing hold of British, French, and Dutch merchants on the import-export trade of the Ottoman Empire, importing Western manufactured goods and colonial produce and exporting raw materials. Greek merchant communities, as a result, were established through most of Central Europe, on the Mediterranean coast, in southern Russia, and even as far away as India. At the same time, a substantial merchant marine developed, which became based originally on the three nautical islands of Hydra, where Alexander Bolinas' family is from and that he has written a lot about, in Spetses and Psara. This merchant marine hugely prospered from running the continental blockade imposed by Great Britain during the period of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. This highly trained sailor class proved to be an unfathomable advantage when the Greek Revolution of 1821 broke out. And Greek fire ships set aflame and when guided towards the Ottoman fleet, became a significant weapon against their naval ships. The emergence of a strong Hellenic mercantile and merchant marine class had a number of important consequences, not only in the newly established Hellenic kingdom in the 1830s, but also Europe, and as we shall see, in America, preceding, during, and after the US Civil War. Currently, as we know, the Hellenic merchant marine fleet is by far the largest by tonnage in the world. I would be remiss, however, today if I didn't mention the island of Chios massacre, which took place in 1822, as this coming month is its 200th anniversary. For over 2,000 years, Chios merchants and ship owners had been prominent in trade and diplomacy throughout the Black Sea, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean. After Byzantine control of the island, the Genoese controlled the island from 1304 to 1566. And from 1566, it fell into the Ottoman Empire. Chios at the time had a special place within the Ottoman Empire, and it was a favorite of the Ottoman sultanas, in other words, the daughters and wives of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. And as such, had control over its own affairs as Chios trade and the very highly valued mastic plant was harvested only in Chios in the world. In March 1822, as the Greek Revolution of 1821 gathered strength in the mainland, several hundred armed Greeks from the neighboring island of Samos landed in Chios. They attacked the Turks, who retreated to the citadel. Although some islanders did decide to join the revolution, the vast majority of the population had, by all accounts, done nothing to provoke the reprisals and had not joined other Greeks in their revolt against the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan, however, hearing the news of the revolt that he assumed also related to the Chiotes, he assumed wrongly, and the Chians supported the revolution and sent reinforcements from the Turkish fleet under the Kapitan Pasha, who was the head of the naval forces of the Ottoman Empire, and who proceeded quickly to pillage and loot the town. Orders were given in late March of 1822 to burn it down. Over the next 4 months, about 40,000 Turkish troops arrived. Besides setting fire, the troops were ordered to kill all infants under 3 years old, all males 12 years old and older, and all females 40 and older, except those willing to convert to Islam. In the end, approximately 3/4 of the population of 120,000 were killed, enslaved, or died in disease. It is estimated that about 2,000 remained on the island after 21,000 managed to flee. 52,000 were enslaved and sold in the slave markets, and 52,000 massacred. Tens of thousands of survivors dispersed, however, throughout Europe and became part of the Chios diaspora. Some young Greeks enslaved during the massacre were adopted by wealthy Ottomans and converted to Islam. Some rose to very high levels of prominence within the Ottoman Empire, such as Yorgos Stavroulakis, renamed Mustafa Kazadar, and Ibrahim Edhan Pasha. Some of the Chios refugees were also adopted by famous Americans, including Samuel Gridley Howe, who fought also in the Greek Revolution and was a major abolitionist within America and during the Civil War and beyond. And during the period that was known at the time as Greek Fire in American history, which we have discussed in other panel discussions relating also to Hellenic orphans of the Revolution. There was tremendous outrage, obviously, when the events were reported in Europe and in America. And the famous painter, Eugene Delacroix, created a painting that most of us are familiar with, depicting the events that occurred. His famous painting was named Scenes from the Massacre of Chios. To our event today. The Hellenic merchants, many with aristocratic family ties to the island of Chios I just mentioned, were the most influential Hellenic American force within America from the 1850s to the 1890s. But their influence is rarely discussed. In this panel discussion, just as we discussed the Hellenic Revolution and the Chios massacre of 1821, these families, these Hellenic mercantile families expanded their commercial firms into various areas, into Constantinople, into Smyrna, into Tehran, into Odessa in Russia, into Vienna, into Marseille in France, into Trieste, into Alexandria in Egypt, Liverpool in England, St. Petersburg in Russia, New York, New Orleans, Charleston, and many other places. And we'll discuss how their operations, particularly dealing with the cotton trade before and during the Civil War, helped in effect to shift that war based on the cotton supplies that they were able to arrange coming from Egypt and India and other countries. With the development of American overseas trade of cotton exports to England to feed its textile mills, Hellenic merchants gravitated to New York and helped develop and took advantage of a pattern known as the Cotton Triangle, whereby they shipped American cotton exports to England and Europe through the port of New York, instead of shipping it directly from New Orleans, Savannah, and Charleston. The major Hellenic firms in the US at the time were controlled by various families, many of them associated with the Raleighs, the Rodocanti, the Facciari families in New York, and in also the families that were gravitated towards the southern states. In October 20, 1855, the New York Times described the activities of these Greek cotton factors and merchants in the US in a feature article, and the rapid growth in the United States of the great Hellenic commercial firms of the families that I just mentioned. I quote from the article. They were described as one of the most brilliant episodes of the commercial annals of the 19th century, and concluded that the Hellenic merchants were, quote, a superior class of businessmen as the commercial world has ever seen. They were not surpassed by any race of merchants in the day. To get an idea of the development of the main Hellenic commercial houses that were established in the US prior to the US Civil War, mainly in New York, but also in the South, they included the Raleigh and Company, which was established in 1851, Evstasios Petrokokkinos, which was established in 1854, Fachitis and Company in 1855, Rodocanti in 1855, Peter, one of the relatives, Rodocanti in 1855 again, Kokos Scaramanga in 1855, George Pitsikos in 1856, Negroponte, a name that's familiar to many of us because he was the head of the CIA. Later on, they established, their company here in New York in 1861, and really I can go on. There's like dozens of them, and within the Civil War, their linkages to other cotton markets throughout the world to supply cotton to England and European mills was important in decisions by those nations during the Civil War to remain neutral in the conflict. Later on, and after the establishment of the New York Cotton Exchange, and we're talking about after the Civil War now, the Greek cotton merchants in the US were major charter members of the exchange, and a Greek merchant was always a member of the board of managers of the exchange from 1870 to 1899. They rapidly, after the US Civil War, expanded their businesses throughout the Cotton Belt with significant number of branch offices and purchasing agencies. They opened American brokerage and warehousing companies in Charleston, in Savannah, in Augusta, in Galveston, in Columbus, in Mobile, and Memphis. Per an Atlantis newspaper article in January of 1906, for example, just to get an idea, the Raleigh interests alone formed, quote, some 20 agencies in the US and exported over $40 million of cotton to Europe. With that, I'd like to open up and introduce our panelists. And we'll start with some short presentations, and then we'll have an open panel discussion. I'd like to introduce Megan Gaston. She graduated cum laude from Clemson University's Honor College in History in 2005, and from the University of South Carolina School of Law in 2008. After opening her own law firm and practice and serving as the city attorney in Chester, South Carolina, she recently returned to a passion for history and is completing her master's degree in history this spring at Clemson. She currently researches the historical context of Clemson-affiliated statewide gravesite locations, which include African American, Native American, and Caucasian, as a graduate research assistant, and teaches early American history as an adjunct instructor at Tri-County Technical College. Her historical interest includes the American South, identity through food, regional cultures, and transnational cultural impacts of history, and the interaction of technology and society. Megan enjoys all aspects of food, cooking and savoring various regional and international cuisines, also science fiction books, movies and television, art and design, travel, and spending time with friends and family. Welcome, Megan, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Alex Blinas, for bringing me into this. And also, it's a wonderful privilege to be on this panel with my professor and also my advisor, Dr. Orville Vernon Burton, who just recently published a book that anybody needs to check out, and we can give you information on that later. But thank you so much for having me here. It is a privilege and honor. Now, I am not Greek. Why?
You don't have to be on this panel.
Exactly. But I have a passion for the study of history for the South, but also the culture, the misconceptions, how we get to thinking about the South in general. And I think this topic is very interesting, and how exactly when you're talking about King Cotton and the cotton industry in the South and how that emerged, why in the world did the South think that they were safe, that everything was going to be okay through the war, that they were going to survive and prevail? It is true that, at the time, right leading up to the Civil War, the South was the leading exporter of cotton, and that was the number one export for the United States in general. It made a lot of money for the folks in the South. Yes, absolutely. And there was this misconception of Southerners that it was there to stay. And I'm going to read, I like the cultural aspect and background, even the idea of King Cotton, where did that come from in the first place? And cotton is king. It's a slogan we know now, but where does that come from? It really was the time period 1855 to 1865 where that really started happening. Phrase was originated by David Christie, who was an anti-slavery writer. But it's interesting, anti-slavery writer, but that slogan was adapted oftentimes by the South here. I'm also going to read right now a poet writing about during the time of the Civil War and about cotton. Cotton and corn were mighty kings who differed at times on certain things, to the country's dire confusion. Corn was peaceable, mild, and just, but Cotton was fond of saying, "You must." So after he boasted, bullied, and cussed, he got up a revolution. But in course of time, the bubble is bursted, and corn is king, and cotton is worsted. Fact of the matter is, the South was a largely agrarian community of many, many farmers, small farmers. Yes, you have the imagery of the plantations. Now, it was a very small percentage of the population that had large plantations. Now, I do have, if we could pull up those images that I provided. Yes, okay. So here, of course, is an image from slavery time in the South, in cotton. We're familiar with these things, but what I want to focus on, if we can go down to the other portion of this, yes. When you actually look at the population of the South in these time periods, okay, we see in 1860, Georgia had over 1 million folks, but the population was relatively low, considering comparison to the rest of the United States. So people alone, that was a huge difference. Also, if you look at the picture below, owners of 50 or more slaves, and all this is South Carolina's statistics. When it says all, we're talking about all states that had slave owning properties. What you see here, those with 1,000 or more slaves, there was only one person in 1860 in South Carolina. Going down to the lower end, 50 to 99, 1,197 in South Carolina. Then you look total. The fact is, the majority of people in the South did not own slaves. They, in fact, just had if they had land themselves, they would grow what they needed and they could actually sell some things. Now, cotton, the reason cotton was such a major thing, it took over the world in a sense, and everyone's eyes were glistening with this concept of, making money this way, and cotton was king. But what was the misconception? Also, the world was continuing on and expanding, and business was expanding. And what we have here is a skewed worldview. I believe that's what happened in the South, where they thought that the South was absolutely necessary, that the cotton production was absolutely necessary, that what they exported was absolutely necessary for the survival of the world. But nope, the world was paying attention, and people had already started, developing practices in Europe, trade, bringing into the Greeks here, that, oh, by the way, the world is sort of flat. We've already expanded in a sense where we can survive without this. Of course, this ends up devastating the South in the end run. Now, the reason I bring this all up is, were people foolish? Were Southerners foolish to think that there would be no repercussions with the outbreak of the Civil War, with secession, that cotton would remain a standard commodity and that they would continue making money? Well, one thing, initially the South just stopped exporting themselves, thinking that they could twist the arm of the Brits into joining the side and supporting the South. That did not happen. And then after that, of course, we had Union blockades. But the thing is here, opportunity and life goes on. When it comes to the economy, the world was changing a lot. And that, I think that is the blind side that I've seen looking back in the past, is the South was just strictly agricultural. We did have industry, we had railroads, but in comparison to the North, and the amount of railroads involved were so slim in comparison. But also the industry and development, other types of economic opportunity that had developed up north, completely killed the prospect of surviving after the war for the South. And we're still to this day dealing with aspects of Reconstruction. I mean, you'll go through small towns and everything looks dried up. And I think a lot of that has to do with, the South was devastated. But the thing is, entrepreneurs, Greek merchants, etc., realized not that they were jumping on an opportunity necessarily. I don't mean that can be taken in a negative way, but business goes on, and demand was needed. And I really think that Alex Bolinas' research into what happened when the Southerners could not deal with cotton so much anymore, what the opportunities they took and the things that happened, and how much the Greeks could influence what happened with a war even. And I mean, there is a possibility, it'd be pandering perhaps, but it's a possibility that the Greeks' involvement is a huge reason why the South failed economically. Definitely. But I think that we need to rethink how we look at history. Oftentimes it's in a nostalgic sort of way, and I love all of that and the culture and thinking about things that way, but we have to look at the facts and numbers economically. The reason why everything failed is all the money was put into agricultural work. People invested into slaves, and we have to talk about slavery when we talk about this subject at all, because absolutely the emancipation of slaves changed the South, because we relied on a slave-based economy where the North was primarily free labor, and the world was changing, and it thankfully so. But I will turn over to my colleague for the next, because I just wanted to set up for his presentation.
Okay, Megan, it's easy to understand why cotton was thought as being king, because there was a voracious appetite, not only in England and its mills, to produce products, by the way, that was sold back to the States, and also in Europe. But there was also a voracious appetite for cotton in the North. In other words, they had their own mills that they had to replenish. And to the extent that in many cases they thought that people would side with them because their mills required that cotton, it was a surprise to everyone that in fact there could be alternate means of cotton, that it could come from somewhere else. And that's part of the discussion also, because if there were in fact no alternate means to feed those factories that produced all these products that got sold back, because it was a whole economic thing, obviously, then certain things economically would have worked out differently from the South. Maybe
story, right?
Maybe England would not have been neutral. It's hard to say. These are all speculations, obviously. So thank you for that introduction into our discussion. Our next guest is known to many of us because Alexander has appeared on some of our past panel discussions. He is a lecturer at Clemson University's Honor College and Political Science Department. He is also a master's degree candidate in Clemson's Department of History, where his thesis concerns a study of the Greek merchant marine that I discussed earlier in my introduction. Alexander has lived and worked in the United States, the United Kingdom, in Greece and Serbia. He is also a licensed attorney, a prolific writer on Greek Balkan topics. He lectures widely on the legacy of Byzantium, and he is also a director at EMCA, the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance. He is the author of two very well-known books to many of us, The Eagle Has Two Faces, Journeys into Byzantine Europe, and also Hidden Mosaics, an Aegean Tale. Welcome, Alexander, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, as always, Lou. It's great to be on this panel. I'm particularly delighted, honored, and touched that my colleague Megan Gaston is part of this panel. She and I speak several times a week in the process of being colleagues in the master's program. We both had the pleasure of taking the Southern Identity class from Dr. Burton, which was one of many classes that Megan has taken with Dr. Burton, but it was my introduction to Dr. Burton and his work, which is prolific when it comes to this very, very interesting part of the country. Part of the country my family and I now call home, that has welcomed us and made us very comfortable here. So it's a great opportunity, as always, to talk about history and to make this history, this Greek history, also very contextual and relevant to our fellow Americans. In my case, my fellow Southerners, though I'm only a few years in the South, whereas both Megan and Dr. Burton are about 10 generations in, but the South has a way of making you feel welcome. So Megan has given me a great segue into my part of the discussion, which will go into a little more depth on the role of the Greek merchants and asking a question: did their work perhaps change the course of history? And it really is an open question, but I think it's one that merits further research and honestly has may have played a subtextual role in changing economic and political history. So if we can pull up the presentation and we'll do a quick walkthrough. So to use the king cotton term that the origin of which Megan talked about, I call these merchants primarily, again, as Lou introduced quite in very good depth, they're generally from Chios. These princes of cotton spread, well, really throughout, all key hubs of economic activity at the time in the global economy, including, of course, in our own country, in New York, and in the several southern ports. This particular picture is from the 1880s, I believe, of a church that was founded in 1864 in New Orleans. Actually, forgive me, 1866. In a lot of ways, it looks like a typical Southern clapboard white church that graced the South all over the place, but it's very much, it's very important in Greek American history, as that was the first Greek Orthodox church in the United States. It was actually the first Orthodox church in the United States by about 1 year, since Alaska, which had been Russian and did have Orthodox churches, would be purchased by Secretary of State Seward in 1867. So it's the first by 1 year in the actual United States. If we go to the next slide, please. So what am I going to talk about? Well, there's a key ethnic component to the cotton trade. And by the way, there were other ethnicities who played a major role in the cotton trade. Jews, Swiss, more localized Armenians, all played major roles. But the Greek merchant families played a key role, and it's largely unknown in their role in shifting the cotton trade out of New Orleans and over to Egypt. And New Orleans was a spoke in this trading hub and became the first Orthodox Christian community in the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is this Greek world in around 1850 as King Cotton was rising to its heights? Well, what you had is a small, impoverished, independent kingdom of Greece, which was much smaller than the Greece of today. It was about 40% of Greece. So basically the area around Athens, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and about a dozen major islands close to Athens. Most of the Greek population at the time remained in the Ottoman Empire, so in provinces like Macedonia, Thrace, Epirus, Thessaly, other Greek islands, Crete, and also the western and Black Sea coast of Asia Minor, along with a substantial Greek population in these merchant hubs in places like Trieste, which I'm showing you here, which was the Austro-Hungarian Empire's biggest port, where Greeks and Serbs controlled the commerce, particularly the shipping commerce, but also places like Odessa, Marseille, Liverpool, Alexandria, and of course, New Orleans. There's a very large merchant fleet even then, flying multiple flags, including Greece, the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and Russia. And Greek ships then and now had a specialty in bulk cargoes and commodities. At that time, primarily grain. The Russians had basically subcontracted the export trade of the Ukrainian wheat fields to Greece. At the same time, the Greek homelands have always had major cotton production, not major relative to Egypt or the American South, but it had always been an industry in Greece. Greece and also the Western Turkey are suited in terms of climate for cotton production. Next slide, please. So again, Lou gave a good introduction, but let's talk about who these merchants were. They were tight-knit family or kin-based organizations, particularly from the island of Chios. Lou explained in quite a bit of detail about the massacre, which sent islanders far and wide. They were often linked with merchant marine families. They helped to bankroll merchant shipping, even at the time for my island, Hydra, and they would often marry into shipping families. These people were ethnic Greeks, often quite declaratively Orthodox Christians, but they would have multiple nationalities, passports, and locations in major economic hubs. That's why history might claim that it was British-based or British merchants that sought alternative economic supply, alternative cotton supplies. Well, they very well may have been British subjects, but of Greek background. So you would find these people having multiple nationalities, and oftentimes that's why we don't hear as much about them, because they would just go under British or Russian. Their business tended to be vertically integrated when and where possible. In other words, they would control both sides of the transaction, origin and destination. Often enough, even the shipments would be with a family or related shipping company. This particular individual is Nicholas Bernanke, originally from Chios, a resident of New Orleans who died in the 1870s. He had been Greek consul, and he was co-founder of Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church, the first church in the United States. Next slide, please. So, in the words of the contemporaries, what did the Greeks' contemporaries in New Orleans and New York say about them? Well, Lou touched on this, so I'm just going to jump through the highlighted items. The Greeks had large capital, harmony of action, close connection with strong Greek firms in the leading commercial cities in the world, secrecy and an air of mystery, coolness of nerve, a boldness and sagacity that astonished the business world. The New York Financial and Commercial and Financial Chronicle, the influence of Greeks in New York and Liverpool markets for cotton, grain, and other produce is so great that a few words about them may not be out of place. They furnished some of the most daring sailors of the Mediterranean, rapid growth of the merchant marine. Their locations, again, French ports, London, Liverpool, Calcutta, US southern ports, 8 or 10 firms in New York. It says they're apparently not jealous of one another. Most Greeks would certainly scoff at that, but they combine constantly for united action, and by means of branch houses, they pay as few commissions as possible, transactions on joint account. And this explains why a Greek can ship cotton and grain where we cannot. And as regards cotton, it is through them that a very large portion of our shipments are made. And this is due to their free and full intercommunication among each other. So in an era just before communications technologies like the telegraph really started to bite into this business, the Greeks' family firms were an excellent way to compete. Next slide, please. So, given the Greeks' role in commodity trade, the boom of the American cotton economy could not escape the attention of these merchant families, and branches came to the US. Of course, New York was, as always, the financial and economic nerve center of the United States, but they also came to New Orleans. And to paraphrase President Coolidge, when he said the business of America is business, well, their business in America was business. And it's important because most of us, and Lou and I are certainly descendants of this, most Greek Americans are descendants of poor immigrants who came in the 1900s as part of the mass wave of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. That Greek was very different from the Greeks like our grandparents or parents that came here. These folks were not coming to work as shoe shiners or black boots. They would go to the Ritz or the Grand Hotel. So it's a very different narrative than what most Greek Americans think of when they think of Greeks coming to this country. The typical merchant was usually a scion or a relative of a merchant house with global operations. Now, their role was important in in New Orleans, but they weren't market makers in New Orleans. They were market takers. However, if we can go to the next slide, in Alexandria in Egypt, they were market makers. And it's worth talking a few minutes about Egypt and its importance. And for that, I really have our friend Alexander Kitroff, Dr. Kitroff's book on the Greeks and the making of modern Egypt, which is a virtual textbook about the role of the Greek population in Egypt. Egypt was nominally, like Greece prior to independence, part of the Ottoman Empire, but they became semi-independent right around the time that Napoleon had invaded Egypt, and they welcomed Europeans, including Greeks, to help to develop the economy. Greeks quickly formed the largest European population and were involved in most aspects of commerce there. For example, from 1839, Greeks controlled 33% of the cotton trade, including production and finance. As we've already said, the Greek merchant fleet was among the most powerful in the European and Black Sea basins. The merchants established in Egypt were part of this global web of Greek merchants. And because of this global web of family-oriented merchants, the secessionist and sectionalist crisis in the United States was known to these merchants. So from the New Orleans archives, I have information of former residents of New Orleans who moved directly to Alexandria and set up shop there. And Egyptian cotton in the Civil War era tripled, which eased cotton supply issues thought by Confederate diplomats to be a potential tipping point to Anglo-French intervention. And the Greeks' operation there, as opposed to New Orleans and the American South, included financing, ginning. The first and latest American and British gins were brought to Egypt by Greeks, brokerage, export, and shipping. It was completely vertically integrated. And while Egypt may be a bit out of the way from Liverpool, it's actually very close to Marseille. And it's still certainly closer to India. So the importance of Egyptian cotton to British and French and German mills should not be understated. Next slide, please. So as I said, Civil War caused many Greek merchants to go often directly to Alexandria. Others remained. Many fought for the Confederacy. The first Orthodox church in the United States was built in 1866. The church was Greek but multi-ethnic, so Serbs, Greeks, Russians, Syrians, and Bulgarians all celebrated there. And this community, primarily of merchants, but also including shopkeepers, artisans, seamen, was very different from the Greek immigrant narrative of penniless mass immigration. Next slide, please. So why is this significant? Well, the shift of cotton cultivation in Egypt as a result of the demand caused by the American Civil War, the self-blockade of the South, as Megan mentioned, then the Union blockade, had a major impact on cotton supplies. And there's no question that Greek merchant houses played a key role due to their expertise in the product and their kin-based merchant networks. This kin-based ethos and expertise remains in the Greek merchant fleet, which is the largest in the world. And also, while it's not very much known in the Greek-American narrative or in Southern history, the role of this merchant class in founding the first Orthodox community in the US is a little known alternative narrative to the penniless mass immigrant narrative that Southern and Eastern Europeans have about their migration to the United States. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to our further discussions.
Thank you, Alexander, for that. And for the audience, I'd just like to make a couple of comments because I think it's going to be very important to the discussion. As Alexander indicated, most Greek people at the time period did not live in what is now Greece. They actually lived outside of Greece, and in most cases in what was the Ottoman Empire. So when we talk about Egypt, when we talk about what is now Turkey, when we talk about Syria, when we talk about the Middle East, that was at the time period the Ottoman Empire, and Greeks were throughout that particular empire. They were interesting people because at the time, because they lived under the Ottoman Empire and were traders with different nations, etc. They were also multilingual. So it's not that they spoke only Greek, as we indicated. The Balkans, all the languages of the Balkans, and certainly Turkish and all the rest of that. A lot of the people that we're talking about spoke 5, 6, 7 languages. Certainly Serbian, certainly many cases Italian, English, obviously, Turkish, obviously. So that's important to note. Also, Egypt, it was part of the Ottoman Empire at the period, but they were basically, to a certain degree, their own nation, if you will. And that had to do with what took place in particular with Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was a very powerful individual within the Ottoman Empire, who created or carved out almost his own area within the Ottoman Empire. And he was born in Greece. He spoke Greek. He was an Albanian. He wasn't an Egyptian. So a lot of the people, when he formed his nation, were actually Greek people. So when Alexander talks about these things, we should keep in mind that, in fact, the people who were dealing in Egypt, the merchants that were dealing in Egypt, they knew the people. That was their countries. And when he mentioned England and all the rest of that, among the largest and wealthiest merchants in England at the time were, for example, the Raleigh brothers. The Raleigh brothers were, some of these people that we're talking about from Chios. And as a matter of fact, 2 of them were actually refugees that came into the United States after the massacre of Chios in 1822. They came as orphans into the United States. So they also understood America. They obviously went back into Europe and developed these massive empires that they had. So these are important things to note. With that, I will introduce our next panelist. Professor Orville Vernon Burton is the inaugural Judge Matthew T. Perry Distinguished Chair of History and Professor of Pan-African Studies, Sociology and Anthropology, and Computer Science at Clemson University, and the Director of the Clemson Cyber Institute. From 2013 to 15, he was the Creativity Professor of Humanities. In 2016, he received the College of Architecture, Art, and Humanities Dean's Award for, quote, excellence in research. And in 2019, the college's award for outstanding achievement in service. In 2018, he received the inaugural University Research Scholarship and Artistic Achievement Award. From 2008 to 10, He was the borough's Distinguished Professor of Southern History and Culture at Coastal Carolina University. He was the founding director of the Institute for Computing in Humanities, Arts, and Social Science at the University of Illinois, where he is Emeritus University Distinguished Teacher Scholar and Professor of History, African American Studies, and Sociology. At the University of Illinois, he continues to chair the advisory board and is also a senior research scientist at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where he served as associate directors for humanities and social sciences from 2002 to 2010. He serves as executive director of the College of Charlestown's Low Country and Atlantic World Program. He served as interim chair, then vice chair of the board of directors of the Congressional National Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. From 2009 to 17 is when he served. In 2007, the Illinois State Legislature honored him with a special resolution for his contributions as a scholar, teacher, and citizen of Illinois. A recognized expert on race relations and the American South, and a leader in digital humanities, he is often invited to present lectures, conduct workshops, and consult with colleges, universities, and granting agencies. He is a prolific author and scholar, 20 authored or edited books, and more than 200 articles. The author or director of numerous digital humanities projects. His books, Justice Deferred, The Age of Lincoln, and In My Father's House, were nominated for Pulitzers. His research and teaching interests are American history, with a particular focus on the American South, including race relations and community, and the intersection of humanities and social science. He has served as president of the Southern Historical Association and of the Agricultural History Society. He was elected to honorary life membership in the British American 19th Century Historians. He is the recipient of many awards, honors, fellowships, and grants. And I can continue. Welcome, Vernon, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and remind me not to send such a long bio next time.
That wasn't the whole bio. That wasn't the whole bio.
I'm a little embarrassed, but thank you. And it's certainly an honor to be here with Megan, my MA student, and with Alex. I appreciate you inviting me. And I thought I would talk about the South and a little bit about the Civil War, which I have written about in the book called The Age of Lincoln. If people are interested to get the true story, as I'd like to say, of what's going on there. I will take a little issue with, I think, what Megan said. I think that the South, the Confederacy, was much more involved in slavery. That is, they were not large slave owners, but also when you do family studies, South Carolina more than any other. And I may be wrong, Megan, but I think that a majority, at least in areas of South Carolina, were actually white people who enslaved other humans. I believe
the
could be wrong.
statistic is high 40s owned slaves, high 40-something% owned slaves.
But if you do it by household, and then if you realize that so many of the sons and daughters were going to inherit slaves, but and it varies by region, so you have to be very careful how you look at it by region. But I really do think that the enslavement of human beings really formed the fabric, as I'd like to say, of Southern history. There's a whole debate, about whether slavery is capitalistic, or it used to be considered whether slavery itself was instead of that, some sort of feudal or different sort of thing. And I've always argued it's a useless debate, because slavery was, I don't want to say a way of life, but it was so much a fabric of life. It influenced everything, even the intellectual development of the South, with the strong pro-slavery theory that justified it. And it changed a region of the country that was certainly one of the most liberal thinking where you had people like Jefferson, the Enlightenment, even the younger John C. Calhoun, on whose plantation that Clemson is represented, excited about Enlightenment ideas. It was Puritan New England, which was restricted by religion and opening up of thought, whereas in the South, very different, and it completely flipped. And my argument is that it is because of slavery and how it's such a part of the life. And I try to remind people there are a number of things, but slavery could not exist without either violence or the threat of violence. You had to make people be enslaved. And I think that culture is still with us today, and sort of the daring do, most of the winners of the Medal of Honor come right out of this region of the South. The whole idea of hard-nosed football, though it was in fact a Yankee sport invented in the North, it's adopted so much it's almost a part of life, where you can go through every year and look at the top 10, 20 teams. They're way overrepresented in the South. And certainly stock car racing and people like Junior Johnson, where it's much more about the bravado, the sort of, I hate to use this term, Megan, and please forgive me, I would tell students not to, but it's almost like the over masculinity that gets associated with both Black and white Southerners. That's such a part of the way of life. So I just wanted to get there, but then we'll talk about the Civil War. What Megan's absolutely right about is this idea that slavery, that cotton, which so much of it, though people without owning enslaved people still grew cotton. In fact, they grew so much sometimes to the detriment of their being self-sufficient. But cotton was king, and the Senator James Henry Hammond echoed that and said, no way, he's from South Carolina, no way would the North make war on cotton. So there's that strong belief. But let's take a moment to look at the Civil War itself. And I think you can do a lot of things with the war. It's very easy, and this is the way I sort of grew up with it, and this interpretation is changing now. And I do think I like to stress, as both Megan and Alex know, that history is an interpretation. There's a literature. We try to approximate the truth. We're trained to work with sources. And that's one of the things I'm excited about, both Alex and Megan's work. Alex work now on this Greek culture, which has fascinated me for a long time in America, particularly with my own idea of the South as other, the Southerner, stranger, who makes up the South, how does the South become? The other part of enslavement is you had to have Black and white together, which was different than other places besides the violence. Though controversial, and we know about the violence and the threatened parts, I think there were, as all humans do when they are living with each other, get to know each other, and there could even be warm relationships. And we do know of some that were more than that is hard to get into. But those are two of the things to understand, I think, about the American South that I think have made it different than the rest of the United States. And I'm so fascinated with what Alex is finding about how the Greek influence has been felt in the South and how that all comes together to make a unique part of the country. Now, one of the things that I sort of grew up with was this idea, of course, of the glorious picture of brave men and women who fought and gave their lives on both sides of the Civil War. In fact, one of the things I did in Age of Lincoln was sort of add up, and it really is a Civil War. When I said James Henry Hammond, who was the pro-slavery, pro-successionist, sort of one of the leaders in the Senate of the South on this whole, his brother fought for the Union. It really was a Civil War. My first book was on a little community called Edgefield, South Carolina, and I did sort of a mass genealogy because no one really knew how many people owned slaves. And that was a big debate when I first started graduate school. It was all locked away in the censuses. And you can link the censuses. You can link the population census with what's called the slave census, with mortality census, all things, and put them together. And one of the things I tried to do is sort of figure out just how many people did own enslaved people and how many families were implicated in it, and tracing over time how people would inherit or not inherit. So the other thing would happen, I would have people say to me, we had this uncle, he went off to the Civil War, or great uncle, literally great uncle in one case, and we never heard from him again. What happened? Well, he became a galvanized Yankee. He was captured and they were given a choice. Now, they didn't want to go back and fight Confederates, but they joined the Union Army. And then if you see any of the John Ford Westerns, you see quite a few former Confederates there, or the great John Wayne film, The Searchers, and all of these sorts of things. Now, he never surrenders. He wasn't a galvanized Yankee, but the others were that you saw in the Union Army. So you add those up, but even more so, every single state of the 11 Confederate states, let alone, Missouri, which was divided, and Kentucky, which had both, but every one of them, except for South Carolina, raised a regiment to fight for the Union. And Lincoln, it wasn't so much for Lincoln, but people forget that Andrew Jackson was also from South Carolina, and he was a Unionist who threatened to hang John C. Calhoun. There were a lot of those old Jacksonian Unionists throughout the South. There were areas that actually rebelled, like in Alabama and things. And those in South Carolina, particularly from the area where Clemson is, though they forget it with their current politics and heritage, literally were sort of had to force to be in the Confederacy, were drafted, and many of them ran away and went to Tennessee and Georgia and joined their regiment to fight for the Union. And then we forget that one of the ways this war was won by Lincoln and the Union were the number of Black soldiers who joined that was legitimate after the Emancipation Proclamation. When you add those together with the white Southerners who fought for the Union, it really is a divided Civil War. And that's just something for people to remember. We just forgot that. Somehow in our retelling of this story, to make the South look a little bit better, and white Southerners at least, we must remember Black Southerners, of course, did not want the Confederacy to win. They wanted the Union to win. So it's, not really fair to say that Southerners wanted the Confederacy to win if you consider Black people Southerners, which I do, and I think everyone else should as well. So it's a much more divided story than we have realized. I recommend Charles Frazier's wonderful book in North Carolina. Down when I taught at Coastal, I found a record that I put into the Age of Lincoln that really fascinated me. There was a judge who wrote a letter and said, "Thank goodness the Yankee troops have finally got here." This is a Confederate judge. He said, "The deserters from the Confederacy in the swamps there in the Low Country were fighting against the Confederacy that we were about to have civil war in Horry County, where Myrtle Beach is." And that gives you an idea of the sort of divisions that we don't think about. And Horry County is another good example. It voted overwhelmingly against secession, but once the war started, it had the highest rate of volunteers, of people who went in to fight. I had a good friend of mine used to claim, well, they didn't know what secession meant, but they knew what fighting meant, and they loved a good fight. So whether that's true or not, it gives you some ideas of what's going on. What I discovered is that most of these troops fought like crazy, particularly never breaking against Sherman until he left South Carolina. And then when they realized, what am I doing? Trying to, they're in South Carolina, they deserted in mass, caused part of the war. But part of what we've done instead, and I think it's worthwhile, But I want to put that in the background, is to talk about how people fought and gave lives, very brave men and women on both sides of the war. Now that would be realistic and is certainly authentic, but alternative, Edmund Wilson, the great writer, what he did in Patriotic Gore, which I think is a great collection of essays. I don't agree with his politics, but it came out of the Civil War. And you can really work at a theme that we forget sometimes, and I think America needs to be reminded of today. War is a horrible thing. And just as is described at the massacre that happened for Greek people, that literally we do horrible things when people go at war. We don't react very well to it. Our society has only a thin veneer of civilization over it. And once you break through that veneer by a war and it gets started, all kinds of inhuman conduct comes to life. Of course, I'm a child of the Vietnam War era and can think of that when normally good people can do horrible things. Part of it is why I did this essay on the South as other Southerner and stranger. You begin othering other people, making them different. And that's always a dangerous thing, I think. Anyway, it's not a pretty aspect of human personality, but that could also, I think, be very true to life of the Civil War. It was a horrible, brutal war. We have photographic evidence, material culture that shows us exactly, how powerful and effective in looking at the brutality of war. So you can do both of these kind of things, but I actually think they can be somewhat crippling. Well, maybe not crippling, but they deal with deeper humanistic values and emotions. So I think the only real quality or scholarly question about the Civil War is why the Confederacy lost. And that's what I'll just talk about a bit there. First, I want to assure people that, and I've been in a lot of debates about this, because in the age of Lincoln, I argue that Abraham Lincoln is actually a white Southerner, and you have to understand him and his sense of honor and his Jacksonian sense of honor and sense of this Southerner. And part of the reason he talks about honor. But people say to me, why did Lincoln go to war? Why didn't he just let the Union go? Because Lincoln made it clear it was not to end slavery, though Lincoln had always opposed slavery. He was never abolitionist, but he always thought it was horrible, wished he could get rid of it, but he was a constitutionalist, and it was in the Constitution, and he couldn't quite figure out how to do it. So he was even willing to keep the Union in to sign an original 13th Amendment, which was said, everywhere that slavery exists now, it can continue, but he wasn't willing to let it spread. And this is part of the trick of understanding why didn't Lincoln just let the Confederacy go, as many people encouraged him. So one of the ironies that people who were seen as much more radical when Lincoln was elected, like a Seward, was encouraging him, let him go, let him go. Tennessee, which did go for the Confederacy, but when South Carolina first succeeded, they said one of a person who actually becomes a general, McAdoo in Tennessee, says, well, let them go. In fact, I'll raise a regiment right here in Tennessee, and we'll go down and dig a ditch around South Carolina, let them float off into the ocean and get rid of them. But once Fort Sumter, the firing on Fort Sumter, the reinforcement, Tennessee went with the Confederacy, and so did McAdoo, and he raised a regiment for them. So it's a moving target all along with the Confederacy and with the South and the Civil War. But I think the real thing is why didn't he? And for Lincoln, it was very simple. I think we don't understand it. And I think it's relevant to us today, those of us in the United States. When Lincoln said that the United States was the last best hope in the world, he meant it. Lincoln was born poor. Now, it's not true that he was born in a dirt cabin that he built with his own hands, but he was born in a log cabin with a dirt floor. And by hard work, by meritocracy, by studying all the things that he valued, he was able to make it at least to upper middle class and became quite prosperous. And he believed in that. He believed in that sincerely. He always hated slavery. And even in the worst of his debates, he always said, well, whether you like people or not, they should go as high as they can by how hard they work and their abilities. And one of the things I loved about Lincoln is that he actually changed his mind. He learned from mistakes, his own mistakes and others, and was not captured by the hobgoblin that Emerson talked about of consistency, but was always growing. And it's a great lesson for any of us interested in education of what I think should be there. So that's why Lincoln would not let the Union go. It wasn't about slavery. It'd have been a lot easier. Just let them go. We don't have slavery in the North. We have it there. There's a different country. But it didn't happen that way. So there's a lot of ways to think about why the South lost. But one of the difficult matters that all of these ideas of why the South lost seem bound up in each other in a rather circular sequence of reasoning. And it's difficult to break that circular argument and find out which is the crucial factor. What we can do, though, is review some of the arguments, criticize them, and test them against the fact as we discover them. This is where I think that some of what Alex is doing on the Civil War is very valuable. Now, Confederate leaders was convinced early that the key to their success lay in gaining recognition from European powers and hopefully getting the intervention of European countries to establish independence, and particularly to break the blockade which the Union had thrown up around their coastal areas and ports, and which was increasingly effective as the war went on. This desire for European intervention was meant for France and particularly for England, the two most important. Southerners, as Megan said, and Alex reinforced, saw cotton as a great leverage in this effort. And at the time, this did seem to make some sense. Numbers vary, so mine might be off from Alex and Megan. They probably looked at it more recently than I have, but more than 3/4 of the cotton in the great textile industry of England and France came from the American South, and of course the North. It was so important there. People, as someone mentioned, people were concerned. The mayor of New York City did not want to succeed. He wanted New York City to either stay neutral or align with the Confederacy. It was that important as people saw it at the time. That is, until the war sort of began and the firing on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's appeal for nationalism. And it's hard for us to imagine, particularly those that grew up in a place like 96, South Carolina, but the only way you can understand Jefferson Davis and the decision to fire on Fort Sumter is imagine 9/11, how people felt. That's how it came to Northerners. It's hard. We've romanticized this. And one of the reasons they did that is because, like I said about the Oconee folks, all these Southerners joined up to have fun in a fight. But as time dragged on, as Lincoln was waiting them out, they realized that my wife and children are getting hungry back home. And all these slave owners, large slave owners who claim, we'll take care of you, we'll make sure your family, we'll get your, and it wasn't happening, then people were getting ready to go back home. And so by firing on Fort Sumter, it gets the war started. Well, the English Board of Trade said in 1859 that India was completely inadequate as a source of raw cotton. Between a fourth and a fifth of the English population depended in some way on the textile industry, and 1/2 of the export trade of England was in cotton textiles. About 1/10 of the nation's wealth was also invested in cotton business. In other words, obviously England was tremendously committed to the textile industry and therefore apparently dependent on the source of the supply of cotton in the American South. Now, to exploit this leverage, the Confederate States, since William L. Yancey, Pierre Royston, Ducey Mann to England in the spring of 1861. They had an interview with Lord Russell, the British Foreign Secretary. And while they were in England, the British and French did grant the Confederacy belligerent status. They did not go all the way to recognize the independence of the Southern states, however, that is the Confederacy. But it was a small victory, but not probably very effective diplomacy. These three men were discouraged and bitter about England's failure to recognize the independence of the Confederacy. Yancey returned to the South in the spring of 1862. Roche went to Spain to repeat the experience of failure that he had in France. By this time, Judah P. Benjamin, who's often been called the brains of the Confederacy and Secretary of State, convinced Jefferson Davis to select more suitable and able diplomats. James Mason Jr. and was sent as commissioner of the court of St. James, and John Slidell to the French court. Of course, these two got off to a relatively poor start. They were captured on their way to Europe in the English ship Trent and carried off by their captor, Captain Lewis Wilkes, to imprisonment in Boston. Lincoln averted what would have been a diplomatic disaster actually by releasing them, or I have a feeling would have had a different outcome. At any rate, the South failed to secure the support they so desperately needed, and I think Alex has hinted at some of the reasons that this was happening. But after the initial successes of the Southern forces against the North, the South renewed its attempt to gain British recognition. Of course, Vicksburg and Gettysburg that happened in 1863 sort of changed all that. We can go on and on and on, but I thought that might give you some background as to how I at least see the Civil War and why this is so important to study the thing. Now, one of the most interesting things is how the world caught on to Lincoln's words that he used. So the working men, at least in Manchester, there's a statue there that I went to see just for this reason, meaning to lose their jobs in the textile industry, they still believed in freedom so much that they supported the Civil War and Lincoln as president, even if that meant losing their job, which is an incredible statement. But it does something that we don't pay enough attention to. And that is that words can touch people. They can mean things. Words can inspire for good and bad. And that was one of the weapons, I think, that Lincoln had, was these inspiring words. And I think they were inspired because he himself believed in them. He believed that this was the last best hope. And something else that people forget in this context is, at that time, where was the rest of the world? With the American Revolution, the ideas of Jefferson's, whatever one thinks of Jefferson today, inspiring Declaration of Independence, what that meant, even though we see it as sexist today, all men are created equal, pursuit of the belief in that inspired the world. You had the French Revolution. You had republics all over the world. Mexico was a republic. But what's happened at the time of the Civil War, we forget why Lincoln said last best hope. The world had gone the other way. One of my favorite musicals, Les Miserables, is Napoleon has taken back over France and made it a monarchy again. Garibaldi, the hero of two continents, reunites Italy and believes it's going to be what do? They become a monarchy. Napoleon III puts a monarch in Mexico. It is the Confederacy, the world of hierarchy that says it's where the rest of the world going. The United States is in fact the one who's out of step with the world, thank heavens. And it's only changed because of Lincoln and the Civil War. When you look at it that way, I think it gives you a different perspective of why Lincoln thought it was. And Lincoln he read the world papers. He read all the news and things that he could. So he was in touch with what was going on with the rest of the world. So that gives you a little bit of perspective. I hope I can go on and on. I don't want to do that. It'll be longer than my bio that you read. Maybe I guess if people have questions, I'm happy to discuss them, why I see it this way. Lincoln does embrace, I don't want to say otherwise, embraces emancipation as he grows and meets African Americans and things, and finally takes a big risk for him, because starting in his first speech, public speech ever, he worries about how do you hold this country together, and something that we struggle with today in the United States. And he talked about it. He said, we are very delicate. On the one side, you can have anarchy, and he pointed to the killing of Elijah Lovejoy in Missouri, who was an abolitionist, by a mob. He talked about the hanging of a black man in Louisville, and in Mississippi, a mob that thought that a group of gamblers were actually people who were going to free people. They were just gambling. And he said, this is anarchy. On the other side, you have dictatorship. How can we balance this? It's always careful. Authoritarianism. And he says, the only way we can do this is the rule of law. So, and that's what he tried to figure out finally, that and his religious motivation that a lot of people misunderstand, his own understanding of his relationship with God, brought him to the idea that at least as a war measure, he could end slavery. And that's what he did. And that's why he also got involved, which no president really done before, with the 13th Amendment. And it's totally historically a mess, but it is a great act and gets the essence of Lincoln in Spielberg's Lincoln movie, of how Lincoln got involved to get that 13th Amendment passed, because he knew it could be challenged. Emancipation Proclamation is only a wartime measure. It's sort of the same thing we deal with executive orders today and how they stand up. So let me stop there, and happy to try.
Vernon, thank you so much for that. It was very interesting. When you speak about Lincoln, I think of Harold Holzer. I don't know if you know Harold.
I know him very well. We were on the Lincoln Commission together.
Yeah, and Harold's daughter and my daughter were fellow students at Yale.
Oh,
so I've known Harold for a few years, and obviously he's also into Lincoln.
Yeah, well, I'll have to tell him it was just his birthday, like yesterday or day before.
Yeah, so mention my name. And,
I will.
Say hello to him.
Send him a birthday.
Hello to him. The interesting thing, just going back to the Greek Revolution for a second, the interesting thing was that during the period in the United States of the 1820s, when the Greek Revolution was taking place, both the Southerners and the Northerners, certainly the Northerners, were all part of this part of history known in the United States as the Greek Fire period. In other words, where everyone was supporting the Greek Revolution against slavery, which was interesting. Even the South, they weren't able to comprehend that there was a difference in their minds. There was a difference between white slaves and black slaves. In other words, they were able to comprehend the Greek Revolution and the ability of white people to become free, let's say, versus in the Ottoman Empire. But even in the South, they couldn't comprehend the slavery aspect as being synonymous with what was taking place in Greece. And as a matter of fact,
this is what was unique about the South, and it became racial slavery.
Yes,
people forget, and the rules of slavery were changed. In England, the child followed and we claim we have English law, the child followed the status of the father.
Yes.
It was changed in the United States. So it followed the mother, of course, meaning that any child born.
And in a famous statue, actually, by I think an English sculptor, the Greek slave,
right?
That came into the U.S. also, and also was obviously in England in the 1850s. Again, they couldn't recognize the difference. But what was interesting was when that statue also went into England, in the English newspapers, they actually had a corollary in terms of a cartoon where they had, similar to the Greek slave that was chained, they had a cartoon picture of a black slave in the South. So it's very fascinating, quite frankly, how people look at all these particular things. Going back to the Greek merchants for a second, one thing, and the concept of cotton is king. One thing that was incomprehensible at the time was the international markets that were developing, that Alex talked upon, in terms of the cotton trade. The South did not, the South realized that, the mills of England, even as you said, the northern states required that cotton. Most of the cotton, I think it was close to 80% at one time of all the cotton in the world was coming from the South. And when the Civil War broke out, however, again, it's not touched in history, certainly not in American history, and Alex has been discussing it, and I've been talking to him about it also, is there was no realization that there were people here from other countries who were dealing with international markets and looking always for markets where things can be bought more economically. One of the areas, of course, was Egypt. And again, as Alex indicated, there was a large population, Greek population in Egypt. And also they had, obviously, to a lesser degree, in India or Calcutta, and some of the so-called English merchants, as Alex indicated, were in fact Greek merchants. So this is like a fascinating discussion. Alex, when I think of New Orleans, I think, of course, of Lafcadio Hearn. Okay, and Lafcadio Hearn, for those who do not know, is a Greek. He was born in Lefkada. That's why he's called Lafcadio Hearn. His father was a British soldier who married a Greek noblewoman. And Lafcadio was an individual who came into the United States post-Civil War. And he's recognized by some people, actually, and you'd like to know this, Vernon. He's portrayed by some people as the foremost ethnographic writer of the 19th century. And one of the things that he wrote about actually was the post-Civil War and the blacks and how they lived. A lot of the writings that he did was in Cincinnati. He married a black woman and basically was ostracized because it was illegal at the time to marry a black woman. And that's what forced him, actually, because he was disgusted, to go to New Orleans, where he also became famous as a newspaper reporter, and ended up in Japan under the name of Kwazami Yakomo, where he became the most famous Japanese writer of Japanese legends and ghost stories. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a funny situation of all these different things taking place in the world. Alex, would you like to just again, reiterate or go into the Greek merchants and actually where they may have been actually the pivot in the neutrality of England and the ability to supply the mills, not only of England, but also Europe and even the northern states at the time when there was a great need for cotton?
Well, certainly. And I agree, Dr. Burton is correct about the power of words and the power of Lincoln in allowing the British worker to absorb some of the pain of cotton shortages, which did result in a great deal of unemployment. There's no question that recognizing the South was unpopular in Britain, but often, like any other country, the British are motivated by economic concerns. So I certainly don't discount the role of public opinion against the South, or the fact that Union victories, Vicksburg and Gettysburg, kind of sealed the deal. But I also think that the fact that the British economy, as Dr. Burton pointed out with those statistics, was so heavily dependent meant that having the alternative sources was absolutely vital to allowing for the British and French to have a foreign policy which did conform with the unpopularity of recognizing the Confederacy. And I think that the role of these merchants is something that has been a subtext of history that merits a great deal more research, which I plan to be doing in the coming years. Certainly building awareness, like with these panels and with the various scholars around the country that have an interest in this discussion, I think is a great opportunity to do so.
And I think I've encouraged Alex. I think it would be a great PhD and a great book if he's interested. I think it will really be important and welcomed in a number of ways, not just there, but also this idea of Southern identity. And the story you just told really fits in perfectly about the writer.
Yeah, I've had a discussion, over the years, obviously, with Alex to pursue that avenue, quite frankly, because it's not something that's been discussed a lot. I mean, I've known about the Greek merchants and the cotton merchants for decades. Actually, it's written in. Again, it's not out there to the general public, including the Greek public. I think I would say most Greeks have no idea about the merchants that we're talking about at all. As a matter of fact, when I announced this particular panel discussion, people were like totally confused. Just like when we had a panel discussion on how the Greek Revolution actually affected the abolitionist movement in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Again, most people could not comprehend that there was a linkage. And these linkages, the history is there. Okay, the history is there for someone to research. It's just that the people have not gone into it. We forget, again, as you indicated, Professor Burton, people take their own avenues in terms of history and in terms of interpretations. And many times, a lot of things are there, important things that quite frankly are not emphasized or just forgotten over time. People forget. They don't go into it unless someone reiterates it. And the South, at least for the Hellenic Americans here, and again, it's post Civil War, but the largest non-religious organization that was founded in the United States by Greek Americans, in fact, took place in the South. It took place in Atlanta, Georgia, and this year is the 100th anniversary of HEPA, the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association. And it had to do basically with combating the KKK. One of the things that was taking place is the Greek businesses. There was an attempt by the KKK to shut down the Greek businesses in Atlanta and in other parts of the South because they employed black workers and in fact paid them the same amount as they would pay anyone else. And they also had a black clientele that completely disturbed the KKK. So the foundations of our largest organization, non-religious, is in fact founded in the South and relating to those particular issues.
There's a lot for Alex to do in this good book he's going to write.
Well, I
better do this, Alex. We're going to hold you to it.
Yeah, you see, there's more and more. The stakes keep going up, but no, there's no question that this, even in South Carolina, because both my colleague Megan and Dr. Burton are what 10th generation South Carolinians. And Megan and I have had these conversations about her family and genealogy, which she said is very much another tie that Southerners and Greeks have, which I think is important. What I find interesting, to your point, Lou, about Greek Americans not knowing about this, when I've discussed with Greek South Carolinians, including a fellow who formerly ran for mayor in Charleston, he had no idea about the cotton merchants at all.
Well, most people don't. You know that. Most people have. I
Well,
would say 99.999%. Maybe there's five of us. Maybe there's five of us who know this, Alex. Not too many
yeah,
people
you're
know this.
correct. You're correct, of course. Yeah, but
Unless someone is a professor of Hellenic American history or something like that, I don't think he would have any idea what we're talking about.
well, and that's why I'm so delighted that that Megan and Dr. Burton are on this discussion, because what I've always found interesting is that our fellow Americans, and obviously we're in the case of Dr. Burton and Megan, we're historians, and of course, Lou, you're a student of history as well. We have this interest, but I found that our fellow Americans are often the people who are most interested in this history and this discussion, and that's why I've been having this discussion at the Clemson Ollie Center. I plan on having this discussion here nearby in Anderson County. They have a great local history museum. What I love about Southerners is they're passionate about history like Europeans are, because the history is deep. The history is often very painful, but it's very much felt. So I'm so delighted at this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Burton, for raising the stakes even more for me now with this PhD. I don't know that my family's going to be happy about that, but I definitely think that that there's a real story here, and I'm so grateful for Megan and your contribution here.
Well, one of the things that we try to do, certainly at EMCA, the East Mediterranean Business Cultural Alliance, we talk about history, obviously, of the Eastern Mediterranean. But what we also try to emphasize is that a lot of the histories that we're talking about are really not only the histories of other people, but they're also intertwined with the history of America, as was indicated before by Dr. Burton. In other words, many of us think today that somehow a century ago, 2 centuries ago, people did not communicate with each other. But anyone who knows anything about history realizes that these currents between Europe, the United States, etc., were constantly taking place. There was communication. People did know what was happening around the world. Other countries absolutely had an effect on the United States of America and how they were thinking. Other peoples affected the United States, just like the United States affected, as Dr. Burton said, throughout the world. One of the reasons when a Greek Revolution, for example, broke out, there was no country in Europe that supported the Greek Revolution. And part of the reason why they didn't support the Greek Revolution was because it was the post-Napoleonic era. In other words, the countries of Europe, England, Russia, etc., they did not want any revolution to take place in Europe. As a matter of fact, they supported the Ottoman Empire over the Greeks who were rebelling in Greece. It was the Americans, basically. It was the Americans more than any other nation, even though the so-called philanthropic movement started in European universities, in particular in schools that taught the Greek classics. It was in America that the fire took place in what they called the Greek fire. It was in America that they formed these Greek committees that supported the revolution, that raised money for the revolution. And it was in America that sent supplies over to Greece. And it was in America that they debated within the House of Representatives whether America itself should join the revolution on the side of Greece. Obviously, though, it got turned. And a lot of the reasons for it, obviously, in anything that happens historically are economic. It is true that the Brahmin merchants in Boston, in particular, Massachusetts, who are dealing with the Ottoman Empire and basically buying, it sounds crazy, but it's true, basically we're buying opium at a very cheap price and selling it into China for 4 times the rate, that those particular Brahmins who had tremendous influence within the politics of the United States actually affected the voting, where in fact it never went to vote. They never went to vote whether they would join in the Greek Revolution. But regardless, the American people, more than any other people in the world, supported the revolution because the Americans were able to associate with the rebellious Greeks that took place when they were rebelling against the Ottoman Empire, because they themselves were rebels against the British Empire.
Can I just add?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Megan, please.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, like, it kind of goes back. I was thinking about Thomas L. Friedman, who writes about flattening of the world in the 21st century. But and Alex Bolinas and I have talked about this before, but I think the world was already flattening in a sense where we were discussing these things, these ideas, and like the connection of the world. And that's the one thing I think when we're talking about with the South, they did not anticipate that the world was ready and prime, to go forward.
As a matter of fact, everybody should know this because this actually ties into the conversation. But Americans did, in fact, go to Greece to fight in the revolution. We discussed, Samuel Gridley Howe, certainly George Jarvis, who was one of the first Americans to join, in the revolution. And we also had a Black African-American slave named James Williams, who left Baltimore and went and fought in the Barbary Wars, and then ended up in the Greek Navy and actually fought and died in Greece. One of the events that we will have in about a month or so has to do with trying to find where the bodies are located of two Americans, George Jarvis and the African-American slave, James Williams, who went and fought in Greece, where exactly they are buried. So we're going to do some ground surveillance surveys and actually penetrate the ground within a particular location where we know they're buried, but no one knows exactly where they're buried, to find them. So I'm going to have a panel discussion on this also in about a month. Yeah.
GPR and LiDAR, perhaps, using ground penetrated radar. Great.
Yeah. GPR. That's exactly right.
Megan knows a lot about that from her current.
Well, we're going to do GPR on a graveyard in Greece, in Argos, which is the oldest continually inhabited city in all of Europe. With that, let's just have some final remarks, and we'll close this very fascinating discussion. I'll start with Megan. Megan, some final remarks.
Final remarks. Again, what I said. I think the interconnectedness of the world at the time, and then this kind of teaches us an awareness to open our eyes to what's going on around you, and showing that so many people at the time when we're talking about Southerners were blinded to thinking that, that Rome won't fall, or that this is the way it goes. But industry continues on. Also, I appreciate very much Dr. Burton's point of how much slavery was an aspect of what was going on in the South. That cannot be denied at all whatsoever. And we always need to be able to talk about these things. Just being quiet about it because it's uncomfortable is not the answer.
Thank you, Megan. Alexander?
Yes, I think Megan's point about the world being flat, to quote Thomas Friedman, even then is true. Certainly, oftentimes the subtext, the footnotes of history are more important than the headlines, and I look forward to making this footnote to bring it up to a headline, since I've now been challenged to do so, and I accept the challenge and I appreciate it. Although I will lean on the expertise of all present. So I'm just throwing back the challenge to everybody on this panel, that I will lean on you for your collective expertise. The one point about the role of enslaved peoples that I think Dr. Burton elaborated in great detail. The one thing I want to mention about recognition of the Greek Revolution, the first state to recognize the Greek Revolution was the Second American Republic, and that was Haiti, born of a slave revolt that recognized Greece and actually sent a ship with volunteers. And again, remember, this was a horribly impoverished country, but unfortunately, those heroes perished in a storm in the Atlantic. So the connections between America and Greece, and Americans in Greece, and slavery, and abolitionism. And look, I'm not going to pretend that these cotton merchants were abolitionists, because obviously they were involved in a trade, but there are so many connections that our discussion is uncovering, and really is worthy of discussion. And again, I'm so grateful that that my Clemson colleagues were here. We're a great university. I'm proud to be a part of it. And thank you as always, Lou, for everything.
No, thank you, Alexander, for being with us today. There's no doubt that Haiti, for the reasons that you mentioned, was the first nation actually to support the Greek Revolution. Not only did they send soldiers that disappeared, obviously, but they also sent a cargo with valuables to be sold if they reached Greece, to buy arms, etc., for the revolution. To the point of Professor Burton, what he mentioned with regards to monarchies, even though Greece had a revolution, in the end, the European powers forced a monarchy on Greece, and the first king of Greece was King Otto of the Hellenes. So this is what takes place. The United States is a nation that is unique in many ways in the world. Our freedoms, the type of democracy that we established, is just absolutely amazing. Professor Burton, some final comments?
I did want to say that I don't want to overdo it, and Megan, you feel free to disagree with me on this, but one of the things that Michael O'Brien's work showed was that I have overemphasized that there were other areas where the South was very creative and innovative, and not all their energy went to pro-slavery, that there really was a mind of the South. That's not an oxymoron, a creative energy, which I never said otherwise. They were very powerful with their pro-slavery argument, and probably won, except not explaining that it was a racial slavery versus the other, when they would quote the Bible and sort of warp every other science, knowledge, way of logic for it. But one of the more interesting things is that how quickly and successfully the South was able to sort of adjust, even though it had not been basically industrial, but around Richmond and mines. And it wasn't just agricultural, that enslaved people could be used in industry. And that's an interesting thing to sort of run through as well. But also because you did not have patents on agriculture, that how particularly Southerners, again, often Black people did some of this and didn't get credit, but in their development of animal breeding, in their crop adaptation, and the development of new strains of crops and things, that it was a lot more creative than people have given it credit for. And one of the things I like that Alex is doing is that we now know about how many Irish, in particularly the Irish influence on the South, but other ethnicities were there and were having an influence. And this is even before the Civil War and continuing afterwards. So thank you. I think it's an exciting opportunity for Alex, and certainly I'm really pleased with Megan as she looks at food ways and food stuff, which is one of the most exciting ways to get at identity that I can think of, and sort of as a hot topic in the history profession now, and she was one of the first there.
I want Megan to pick up Lefkadius Hearn's book that he wrote on Cajun cooking.
I'm looking forward to it
in the 19th century. So that should be pretty interesting. I'd like to thank all of you. It was an amazing discussion. I think the first discussion of its kind, actually, with regards to this particular topic. I know Alex has been researching it. Certainly, I've been dealing with it over a period of time. And I'd really like to thank all of you for being here today with us to share this, which is not only a Greek story, but it's an American story, which is even more important because we are all, of course, Americans. For the audience, I'd like you to join us on our next panel discussion on February the 20th. The event will be on the panel discussion will be on the 100 years of the building of the Palace of the Pontian Hellenism of Surmena, okay, which is something that's a very interesting situation after 100 years since the transfer of populations and the genocide of the Pontian Greeks in the Black Sea area. For those who want to know more about our events, you can go on the internet under EMBCA, embca.com, embca.com. For those who are interested in AHEPA, which is an organization that I said is the largest Greek organization in the United States, and which was founded on combating bias, and is a philanthropic organization. Go to ahepa.org. That's AHEPA.org. And again, we have had many panel discussions. We have a tremendous amount of valuable information for those who are interested in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. And you can go to our YouTube channel, which is under EMCA, EMBCA, our YouTube channel, and subscribe. There is no cost to this thing, so subscribe to it. At least you'll keep up to date with all the things that we're trying to do. Again, thank you to the panelists for this absolutely phenomenal and extremely important and interesting topic. And we'll see you for the next panel discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks again. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.